I've got loads of these containers lying around from various box sets that I've bought over the years, so I thought it was about time that I put in a bit of effort and ticked them off the to-do list once and for all. I'm going to show you two very simple methods and one more involved one to make your containers look absolutely great on the battlefield with very little effort. The first thing to do is prime the containers. A big time saver here can be to use a coloured spray over the bare plastic, and that saves a step or two. GW sprays can be very expensive though, so this step can be done with a large brush over an undercoat. If you could get your hands on a spray, you could knock out a ton of these in no time at all. I used Macragge Blue and Mephiston Red for these containers. Whichever method you choose, just try to get a nice even coat with none of the plastic showing through. If you've got the brown plastic models, be very diligent because that'll show through a bad undercoat very easily. That's you done. Containers painted. I'm just kidding. After that's dry, grab a fairly decent brush and some Agrax Earthshade. What we're going to do is panel line the whole thing. This can take a while, but you don't have to be neat. These containers are going to look grimy anyway, so if there's a wee bit of overspill on Agrax out of a corner or whatever, it doesn't matter, it will just add to the effect. Draw your brush along every crease and crevice on the container and just take your time with it. This is exactly the same process for the red and blue containers, so there's nothing different between them. You'll need a big dry brush or makeup brush for the next step. Dry brushing is a technique that is absolutely tailor-made for painting terrain. All you do is you get a little bit of paint on your brush and you wipe off most of it on a paper towel. Don't make the mistake of leaving too much paint on the brush thinking it will give a better effect. All it will do is leave streaks across your model. If you're worried about the amount of paint you have in your brush, you could maybe test it on the underside of the container, because unless you're going for a special effect where the container's flipped over for your terrain build, the underside won't be seen that much. The actual technique of dry brushing is very easy, especially with these containers because they have nice sharp edges to catch the pigment from the brush. So all you do is draw your brush back and forward across all the edges, side to side. Just make sure you catch every single edge. If you don't see the highlights building up immediately, don't panic, don't be tempted to put more paint on your brush, just go over it another couple of times. For the red container I used Asterath Red, which is a dry paint, and then I used Trollslayer Orange and Fire Dragon Bright, decreasing the pressure each time, making my strokes lighter and lighter as I go. I honestly don't know if the Asterath Red did much in this colour scheme, so maybe just skip to Trollslayer and then add Fire Dragon Bright on top of that. With the Fire Dragon I didn't even add it to every single panel, just where I thought the light would catch the most. It was exactly the same process for the blue. Onto a strong base of Macragge Blue I then dry brushed Alitok Blue, Calgar Blue, and for a very fine highlight, same as Fire Dragon Bright, I used Fenrisian Grey. It's entirely up to you at this stage whether you want to leave it as a relatively clean look or add a bit more weathering. I've got examples of both so you can see which one you like. If you want to go the weathered route, it's very easy. You just grab a little bit of sponge. You've probably got sponges lying around the house. If you're going to take your mum's dish sponge, make sure you ask her first. Tear a bit off, dab it into Dryad Bark, which is a nice dark brown colour, and then dab most of it off on a tissue. So what you're trying to do is catch some of the raised edges with just a little bit of Dryad Bark sponged on. So be quite sparing with this because if you add too much it just looks a bit silly. After you're happy with the effect, do the same with a really bright silver. I chose Stormhost Silver in this case, and dab it on roughly the same areas. It'll catch some of the brown and look like a chipping effect. It's very quick and easy to do. You're then free to paint in the details like the lights and the control pads, and then you are done. They're tabletop ready, you can use them for a game. Now those methods and paint schemes are very easy to do, but there is a danger that they could become boring if you have too many of them, so I tried something a bit different. I decided I wanted a flat surface on one container, so I used a very sharp knife and cut away all the detail on the 3 panels on the side of one container. It did take a while, but it was surprisingly easy to do. I left a few gouges in the surface of it when I was cutting away because it was difficult to get the right angle when I was cutting, but those actually just look like dents and scratches in the side panel, so just leave them. You don't have to do anything, you don't have to fill them if you don't want to. There'll be a nice detail later on. It was still a bit rough in places, so I used 120 grit sandpaper to obliterate the rest of the bumps. The 120 grit sandpaper caused a few scratches on the panels which I didn't want, so I got some finer 400 grit and sanded it down, and it was absolutely fine after that. After getting rid of the dust from sanding, I primed it white. For this next bit I used masking tape, but you don't have to. If you've got a steady hand then this bit could be done without quite easily. I picked up a pack of 5 or 6 rolls of differing widths on Amazon for about £12, so it wasn't too expensive and I'll get a lot of use out of it. I haven't done a lot of masking in my career so far, so this was a bit of trial and error. First of all, I tried to wrap masking tape all the way around the container and just spray on top of that. and I got too much overspray under the tape, so I had to find a different way of doing it. So I cut bits of masking tape that just fitted into the panels, so that the panels themselves would definitely be clean. And then after that I did the wrapping trick, so just wrapped it all the way around the container and used my fingers to press it down so that it was in all the details, so that no spray could get underneath. For this next step I broke out my airbrush just to save time, but you could just as easily use a brush or a spray can if you've got the right colour. I airbrushed the rest of the container with Gryph-hound Orange contrast, which worked really well. I was surprised, I've never airbrushed contrast before, and all I did was pour it straight into the cup, no thinning or anything, and it worked absolutely brilliantly. I built up a really strong orange colour in multiple passes, making sure I didn't miss any bits. With the masking tape still on, once it was all dry, I used the same dry brushing technique as earlier, using Trollslayer Orange and some Fire Dragon Bright. Peeling the masking tape was very satisfying, and I didn't expect it to be perfect, but it was as near as I can get, so I was very happy with it. It left a really clean line around the model, so I was delighted. This next bit is entirely optional, entirely skippable, but I do feel it really added something to the model, and that is we're going to print out our own decals. We'll need an inkjet printer, waterslide decal backing paper, and a can of varnish or lacquer. If you don't have any of these things, and let's face it, why would you? You could always try freehanding onto the nice smooth panels or just leaving them blank. I created the transfers that I wanted to print out in Photoshop on an A4 template. You can choose any logo you want with any colours you want. Because we're applying these homemade transfers over a white background, all the colours will show up absolutely fine. If you applied them over a black, probably it wouldn't show up as well. Just off the top of my head, here's a few ideas. You could find some graffiti online, you could draw your own, you could invent your own grimdark company, anything you want. I went with Ironhead Industries to tie in with my squats, and all I did was modify the Stark Industries logo. It was really important that these transfers fitted on the panels properly, so I measured the middle panel of the container and it was 2.9 centimetres, so I created a little guide on my transfer so that I would know where to cut, and it actually worked perfectly. I was really surprised. We need to print the transfers out on waterslide decal transfer paper, and once it's printed out, take it out to the garden and seal it with varnish or lacquer. If you don't do this step, then the transfers will just run when you put water on them, so it's really important that you do that. After cutting the decal up, applying it was actually the trickiest bit by far. So it's the same as a normal transfer. You wet the backing paper, it goes a bit soft, and then you can move it about. So I used a paintbrush and shifted the decal up a little bit on the backing paper. Then I used tweezers to grab the backing paper, moved it into position, and then used a paintbrush to tease it onto the container. There was a lot of trial and error, had to get rid of a few decals because I crumpled them up, but in the end I got it looking okay. There's not many tips I can give for this. All you have to do is do your best and try to line it up as best you can. After it's in place, dab it with a tissue very gently so that there's no moisture on top, and then apply Microsol over the whole thing. If you don't have Microset and Microsol, you can substitute gloss varnish for Microset and Lamian Medium for Microsol. It doesn't do as good a job, but it's passable. The Microsol softens the transfer and blends the edges into the model really well. It's time to apply some weathering now, and you'll notice we did this in a different order than we did with the blue and the red containers. So we're going to panel line with Agrax Earthshade. If you created any nicks or scratches when you were cutting with the knife, fill them in with Agrax Earthshade as well. I also painted some dirty drips down the side of the container using Agrax Earthshade. Just be careful with it, just paint very thin lines. You could paint a thicker line at the top and then have the dirt dribbling down out of that. Just randomise the length and the thickness of these lines just to make it look a bit more realistic. Once again, don't overdo it because less is more in this case, I think. I went back to this stage a few times because I wasn't happy with it, but just do what you think is right. Next we'll do some sponge weathering, but a bit differently than we did before. On the white bits, sponge on a little bit of Trollslayer Orange. This is to give the effect that the white is painted on and the container is orange to begin with, so the orange is kind of showing through where it's chipped. You can also sponge a little bit of orange where the white and the orange meets, so you just want it to go onto the white a little bit, just so it looks like it's fading into it. I went back to the Dryad bark and just did that all over the container, the same as I did with the red and the blue ones. I didn't add any metallic paint on top of this, but if you feel it needs a little bit extra, then feel free to do it. On all the scratches and dents, I added a little bit of white scar underneath to give it a little bit more depth. The decal was looking a bit clean at this point, so I got a little bit of Corax white and sponged it onto the white letters to make it look like they were coming off a little bit. So that's it, that's the containers finished. If you're looking for another painting video from me, I'd highly recommend this one. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.